Good afternoon. My name is Allison James. I'm the Memorialization Project Director for the Montpelier Descendants Committee. Thank you all for joining us. It is my honor to introduce our panelists for the first panel, The Constitution, Social Justice, and Democracy Through Parity. The panel is led by Sharon Pratt, former mayor of Washington, D.C. The panelists are Dr. Michael Higginbotham, Lawrence M. Katz Professor of Law and former Interim Dean, University of Baltimore School of Law. Dr. Hassan Jeffries, Associate Professor of History at The Ohio State University, Chair of the Montpelier Foundation Board. Please welcome our distinguished guests.
Good afternoon. I'm Sharon Pratt, and I'm certain that they gave me some notes, but unfortunately I can't read them. So here we go. It is my great honor to be here at Montpelier, to be here with such two distinguished scholars, here to reflect on the history of our Constitution. I have a good lawyer out here. Elaine is going to hold me to task. And also the role of some of the reality of American history, who are so beautifully and wonderfully expressed by our Descendants Committee, who are also assembled here today. I was here January 30th. I'm with just to give you background and not to give you undue history, but I was here January 30th, and I'm with the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History, and we're housed in Washington, D.C. at the University of the District of Columbia, and we have a particular mission to rediscover the history of Washington, D.C. And as we went about that, we came to appreciate that there were three founding fathers, Madison, Jefferson, and Washington, that were pivotal to bringing the capital to the South along the banks of the Potomac. And of course, as you know, in the Continental Congress, the capital was in Philadelphia. And many thought that, without a doubt, that the capital, after having a constitution, the gentleman we're going to talk about today who brought that constitution about, it would certainly be in Pennsylvania. But then there was a big debate that went on. And of course, all of the Congress at that time was where? In New York City. That was where they had gone. And you probably know about that because you went to see probably Hamilton, right? And if you went to see Hamilton, you would know about the song, The Room Where It Happened. Mm-hmm. D.C. is what happened. Mm-hmm. It was Madison, Jefferson, and of course Hamilton. They were having this big debate, and of course Hamilton needed their votes. He wanted the capital in New York, but ultimately he accommodated Jefferson, Madison, and really in the background always, but always a huge influence, Washington, to bring the capital to the South. That's really what it was about, along the banks of the Potomac. And again, I tell people, you don't think D.C.'s the South, just listen to me talk. And that was about because they were concerned Pennsylvania was leaning as an abolitionist state. And the best way to ensure that slavery would be protected was to bring it to the South. So, we were lucky enough to come here initially because we said, well, let's go and talk about Madison, Jefferson, and Washington. I said, let's begin at Montpelier because, hey, I'd grown up in D.C. and I knew the French family, and I saw Jamie French, and I said, reached out to him. And we brought our first event here, and it was a great blessing. So today, in the spirit of that, we know that James Madison, as did Jefferson and Washington, had profound impact upon influencing the character and the culture of our country. And amazingly, a lot of what they did still are points of conversation and points of tension even today. And so what are we going to do today? We're going to talk about the Constitution. And we have two scholars who can really guide us on what did they have in mind when they said, we the people? Did they have a very narrow view or broader view? And how would they perceive where we are today? How would they reconcile what they put to pen as against to some of the realities of today in 2023? So we have Michael Higginbotham. And he is, as he said, a president's worst nightmare. He's not an assistant professor. He's not a full professor. He is an endowed chair, so they got to deal with him forever at the School of Law at the University of Baltimore.
That's right.
And we're delighted to have him. He is a very informed and fascinating person. And of course, we have as well Professor Son Jeffries. And he is really a bigger-than-life personality. He, of course, is at the Ohio State University. He's an assistant professor of history. But more than that, if you've ever seen his TED Talk, it is so powerful and so compelling on a topic that maybe we've heard about many times, and yet he brings it to life. He animates it in a way that you have to pay attention. So I am confident we're going to have an extraordinary conversation this afternoon as we celebrate the many families attached to and a part of this wonderful history, the Descendants Committee. And I really should acknowledge our new executive director. We're so honored to have you here. And with that, do I begin with you?
We can.
Well, I mean, you know, you're always a good place to begin. Please.
Well, it's an honor to be here and to be, as you said, a part of this extended family. All those who are connected to Montpelier, and to have, some serious conversation. This is a serious moment that we are in, and I'm not talking just about the project of memorialization and the work that we are doing here. I'm talking about the Constitution and talking about the United States. One of the myths that we have to reconcile with as people who live in this country is the myth of perpetual progress. This idea, particularly as it relates to the role of race and racism, but this idea that things may have been bad once, but this is America, so things always get better. Right? The myth of perpetual progress, that no matter what happens, things will always get better. The problem with that is that time is not a social force. Time does not create change. The mere passage of time by itself does not create change. What creates change are the actions of people. And so if we let time just pass, nothing will change. And in fact, things will revert back to the status quo. And if that status quo is negative, if that status quo is harmful, it will only be reinforced. I say that to say, thinking about the Constitution, thinking about this nation, thinking about our democracy, and thinking about where we are not guaranteed to have this democracy going forward. This is something that we need to understand. This is something that the framers, that Madison understood. Yeah. That there's nothing guaranteed about what we're putting into place. And just because it's existed for 250 years almost, doesn't mean it's going to be here for another 251st, the 251st. So we have decisions to make about what we want to see going forward. What we want this country to be going forward. How democratic do we want it to be? And what guardrails are we going to use? Are we actually going to live up to what's in the Constitution? Are we going to abide by what's in the Constitution? And we'll get into that, we're facing real challenges from large segments of the population about what this future should be. And what the future should be is often rationalized by how we frame the past. That's why that connection between the past and the present is so critical, because we will get today wrong if we get yesterday wrong.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Professor Higginbotham?
I don't have my notes either, so I'm going to have to do it from up here. I, too, am honored to be on this panel with Hassan, my chairman, and with the mayor. Every time I come onto this property, I get goosebumps, because for a con law professor, there's no more important place to be than here. The mayor said it's where the room happened in D.C., but for a con law professor, right in the big house, in that library, that's where the room happened, because the concepts, the key concepts, separation of powers, enumeration of powers, federalism, they were all first thought about right upstairs in that library. The most important, though, is what the mayor mentioned earlier, the title of this conference, the words you see as you drive into Montpelier, we the people. And I can tell you that one of the proudest moments I've ever had in terms of the Constitution and being proud of that original Constitution was when I was working on issues in South Africa on anti-apartheid matters. And in the mid-1990s, I was in Johannesburg, had a chance to see the draft of the new South African Constitution. And when I looked at the first 3 words in that draft, tremendous pride as an American, as a believer in the Constitution, came to my heart. And that's because the 3 words in that South African Constitution were taken right from the American Constitution. We, the people of South Africa. And that's important. That concept, we the people, is important. The definition has often been problematic. And we can talk about that definition. When I think of James Madison, and he was a complex individual, he was a very bright individual, very well-read individual. But when I think about James Madison, if I have to do my elevator talk, the 20 seconds before someone gets off the elevator, I would say that Madison had it right on religion and dead wrong on race. And that, I think, goes to what Hassan mentioned earlier. And it really is about history. Hassan said it's not guaranteed that in America we're going to continue to make progress. I agree 100%. It's not guaranteed. And when I look at this history of America, particularly dealing with issues of racial inequality, we've often taken 2 steps forward, and then we take 1 step backward. 2 steps forward and 1 step backward. And I think if you see the 4 kind of main periods historically, slavery, the founding, Reconstruction, and the Civil Rights Movement, and where we are today, in each one of those periods you see steps forward, but also a step backward. And I think that's what we're seeing today.
Well, let's talk about where you think the founding fathers, in particular James Madison, might have envisioned how the Constitution would have been applied, and where they might be in what is perceived as a more polarized political environment today. Now, of course, people will highlight there were many times in America we had polarized political environment, not to mention the Civil War. But James Madison started out, I think, and I'm not the scholar here, I'm a politician, so God help you with the facts there. But he started out somewhat of a Federalist, because he, of course, was one of the authors of the Federalist Papers. He really pushed to have a more authoritative governmental structure, because the Articles of Confederation did not work. But soon he drifted towards Jefferson's Republican system. I mean, he became a supporter of that. So where would he be today? I mean, we're at a point now, and I'm not trying to single anybody out, but we're at a point now where some 58% of the registered Republicans say that January 6th was a legitimate expression of protest. 80% said they would not have they do not think Biden was legitimately elected. And we saw 147 votes in the wake of that day where they would not accept the outcome of the election. So it's a pretty tenuous situation now. Where would Madison be? Would he be outraged that they would do that, or would he be in support of that? I'll begin with you.
Yeah. So it creates an interesting problem for us to sort of take that apart, because what we saw on January 6th was political violence. It was an attempt to use violence to stop the peaceful transfer of power. Political violence. 1 year after January 6th, on the first anniversary of that moment, President Joe Biden gave a very powerful speech in which he condemned white supremacy. He talked about political violence and condemned what happened on January 6th. But he also said, in giving those remarks, he said, what happened on January 6th? He said, that's not who we are. And I was folding laundry, because that's what you do when you got little kids. I was folding laundry while I was watching, and I was like, Joe, we on a first name basis. I was like, Joe? I was like, wait a minute, hold on a second, Joe, that's not who we are, right? And then he went on to say, and that's not who we have ever been. And I was like, now hold on, Joe. Right? In other words, this nation was conceived out of political violence. That's what the American Revolution was. This nation was almost torn apart through political violence. That's what the Civil War was. This nation almost stopped the civil rights movement, the gains of expanding democracy through political violence. Whether we like it or not, political violence is in our DNA, and we have to reconcile. Now, that being said, too often we hear today that the rationalization for the use of political violence in this nation against the government is done in the tradition of the framers and the founders. But here's the thing. They were like, no, the political violence is necessary to free ourselves from the monarchy. But once we establish the nation, that's done, right? It's like, and so we have to, it's interesting because and we see this often around the Second Amendment and stuff like that. Like, no, the right to rebellion is over. For Madison, it's done. For those who are Americans, right? The threat after the revolution. So when we're thinking about the creation of the Constitution and the protections to preserve sort of civil order, before the American Revolution, the threat is from above. The threat is the monarchy, right? The threat is Britain. The threat is overseas. And it's a coming together of the colonies to defend against that external threat from above. But once the nation is formed, the threat is no longer from above. The threat is from below. The threat, and I'm not talking about the citizens, the threat that they were worried about were the enslaved folk. The threat that they were worried about were indigenous people, right, who would engage in acts of rebellion. Right? There was going to be this sense of the political violence is done. Right? We have to organize to make sure that those we're holding in bondage don't rebel against us. But those who are part of the body politic no longer have a right to rebel against the government. There would be no need to, because the government represents you. And so when we think about those instances of the use of political violence to stop the forward momentum of the nation, it runs counter to what the framers and the founders had in mind for those who are a part of the body politic. So, but we see this coming up constantly. During the Civil War, the Confederates, they waved the flag of the founders, saying that we are acting in the best tradition of the founders and the framers. It's like, no, you're not. You're trying to destroy what they created. On January 6th, they were trying to destroy what was created beginning here. And so, yes, there's a history of political violence in the United States that we have to reconcile with, and done in the name of racism. That's what the Civil War was, and redemption, and what January 6th was, if we want to be frank about it. But that doesn't mean that it has to define us. In fact, the framers and the founders were trying to get away from that. This is why they were so concerned about parties. They eventually move in to embrace them. In the beginning, it's like, no, why would you need parties if everyone's committed to the same political purpose? We've gotten a long way away from that, but it's important that we understand sort of where we started as a nation and these original concepts.
So let me ask you this, Professor Higginbotham, in keeping with what Professor Jeffries has said. To what extent do you think Madison and others had a very narrow view of we the people? After all, by and large, those were patrician white men, only men, who had any power. And we see now, even beyond race, there is in this era of designer babies an enormous push against women having any authority in terms of reproductive rights. I mean, why in the era of designer babies are they consumed with this issue? So is this about narrowly constructing or preserving a notion of who is we the people, and therefore anyone who steps out of that, we're going to push them back? I don't know. I'm asking.
Yeah, you're asking the tough questions. No doubt about that. I think one of the most important things to think about in this question that was posed, and I think Hassan responded in a direct way, and I think his response was a good one. The way to think about this is who we were is not who we have to be. Who we were is not who we are today, at least in my mind. And I look out at this audience, and I'm delighted. I'm delighted to see, because this is America. See, you look at this audience, this is America. And when you think about James Madison was all about the parity and the inclusivity and the pluralism with respect to certain things. If you look at the House and the Senate, we got to have 2 senators from each state. Then we got to have individual representatives from each one of the states so that we can reflect that inclusivity. He did that with a number of things. The mayor mentioned D.C., where D.C. was placed. So there was a number of things that occurred that reflect trying to be inclusive, trying to deal with a number of aspects. But when you think about race, and then the mayor asked me also about women's rights, you're bringing in a whole lot of things about who we were and who we are today. So when you think about defining we the people and who we were and who they meant, fascinating to look at the Declaration of Independence. See, all of us know about the Declaration of Independence and what it said. We hold these truths to be self-evident, right, that all are created equal. But there was a draft. See, the final version was not the original version. The original version had a nice long paragraph in it. The original version said, "We despise the king because he kidnaps people from a distant land who never, ever did anything to him." And what does he do? He enslaves them. Now, if that had been in if that had been in the final version, we could talk about, hey, what does we the people really mean? Although that draft paragraph got dropped. Why? Because James Madison understood the hypocrisy of that statement if slavery was going to be permitted under the original Constitution. So they dropped it out. Now, a couple of other things you want to think about, we the people. You're fighting a war. Folks want everybody to fight with them. So yes, they had black regiments from Rhode Island and Massachusetts fighting in the Revolution. But when it came time to then, after they won, to draw up who's going to get the rights and privileges and benefits. Even Dolly Madison didn't get the right to vote, right? Even Abigail Adams didn't get the right to vote. So when you start thinking about who we were, you know, we were rich, white, male Protestants, and one Catholic get some rights and privileges, or at least all the rights and privileges. And then there are others. Now, the good news is James Madison, while he got it right on religion, while he said, hey, look, we want separation of church and state, and we don't want any discrimination against all of the different religions. We got a whole lot of different religions here. He didn't do that with race. But I think if he looked at the Equal Protection Clause that was put into the Constitution in 1868, I think he would have said, you know what? That makes a lot of sense from what I try to do with religion. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I got it wrong. I think he's big enough to admit he got it wrong, looking back. And then, when you think about today, people ask me all the time, you know, what about this Dobbs decision? What about this affirmative action decision? My short answer is, it's political. These aren't judicial decisions. I teach this stuff. We got 60 years of precedent on both abortion rights and on affirmative action. And if you look at what the majority said, and Elaine Jones is out there, you know, you were mentioned already, but my hero, you know, one of the greatest litigators in the history of this country fighting for individual rights. When you look at Dobbs and you look at the affirmative action decision, Harvard case, they're political decisions. You got 5 or 6 justices that said, hey, we don't really care about the precedent. We don't really care about the law. We know what we want to do in our hearts, and we're just going to say it, and we're just going to do it. So we can talk about solutions at some point if we have time, and I'm happy to do so. Solutions about the Supreme Court's interpretations, limitations on rights, as well as others. But I think that's probably enough said on James Madison and who we were and who we are.
Well, you know, many societies, many democratic societies today are engaged in tension around the notion of autocracy. And many believe we are experiencing that tension as well. And a lot of it may boil down to who has power and who has no intention of giving up that power. Frederick Douglass said it best, power concedes nothing without a demand. I don't know what it's like to have that kind of power. I don't know, maybe I'd be trying to hang on to it also. But we see it played out in a number of ways. Do you think, after working so hard to craft this Constitution to achieve that more perfect union, would he be there in the fight to say, hey, you're not going to do that after I did all this? You're not going to allow us to basically surrender to becoming an autocracy.
Yeah. Where would Madison stand? He would stand with those who are fighting to preserve democracy. He had some growing to do. I think you're right. By the time we got to the 14th Amendment after the Civil War, when slavery had come to an end, you know, I would like to think that he would have admitted that he was wrong, that he needs to extend the kinds of non-discriminatory treatment that he saw in religion to this thing called race. He had some growing to do. But he believed in democracy. He believed in protecting within that small definition of we the people, but he understood and believed in protecting the rights of the least within that group. And he believed in this project. He believed in this experiment. So and in a way, he didn't quite trust government either. Not in the ways that we think about it, right? Not in the ways it has been spun over the last 40 years for political purposes. Right? I mean, the anti-authoritarian impulse that we now see coming from the political right was not born under Donald Trump. This goes back really to the civil rights era when Republicans were Democrats and segregationists. And they began to challenge the authority of the federal government, saying that you are almost in the echoes of the Civil War era, that you are infringing upon our rights. And so what do we have in 1980 with Ronald Reagan running for president, saying what? Government isn't the solution, government's the problem. When you start talking about government is the problem, in a different way than we saw the framers, we saw Madison talking. Madison was like, listen, we need government because we ain't angels, right? That's Madison. He said we need government, but we also have to make sure that there are limits on government, right? This is why he's like, okay, well, we need to have a Bill of Rights to make sure these are the rights that we can't have government infringe upon. So he understood that there would be limits to government, but he didn't think government was the problem. He said there's a role for government, but once you start down that path, government's the problem, government's the problem, government's the problem, then what you see now, where people are saying we don't have to listen to government when government doesn't reflect what we want it to reflect, then you're going to have a problem. And we have that problem right now. It's centered around this authoritarian impulse. So we have a big problem.
Yeah.
We do.
Before opening it up for questions, I'd like to ask you the same question, Professor.
Sure. And again, I think what Hassan is talking about is really critical, because what Madison believed in was the consent of the governed. Government can be helpful. Government can be problematic when it doesn't have the consent of the governed. And so I think when you look at today, and when you look at some of the swinging to authoritarianism around the world and also here, you're looking at people that are upset because they lost, even though the government had their consent. They just didn't vote for the majority of the people who voted in candidates. And so when you lose, and I mean, this is playground, this is playground. When you lose, you don't take your ball and go home and then come and get a bat and come back to the playground. You don't do that. I mean, what kind of a message are we sending to our kids? When I was growing up playing baseball and football, my parents said, good game, but you guys got beat today. You learned a lesson. And you're gonna try harder next time. You're gonna prepare better next time. But you lost, and you have to accept that. This is about democracy, and we're a leader for the world. I know that maybe the last years don't reflect that, but we're a leader to the world. In many respects, we're the last best hope. I believe that. And with that said, we have a special responsibility to show the world that democracy can work. One of the problems is that we're showing the world that it's not working as well as it should be. So we got to show the world that it can work. I believe we're going to do that. And I look forward to some solutions that will make the thing a little bit better for everybody.
Good. Well, of course, I don't know about your experience, but when I was in high school, my school, Roosevelt, we would go to these football games. I won't give the name of the school. The other school one of them said, okay, Sharon, if we don't win the game, we're going to win the fight. So that's what. So I think we may have a dynamic like that here in America. We'll open it up for questions, please. Yeah, Elaine, yeah.
Would Madison have believed in a representative democracy? I mean, his voters were not our voters of today. His voters were probably white men. And now, young folk 18 years old, women, black folks, Native American, I mean, everybody was having the right to vote. What would you think about that?
Theoretically, I'd like to say that, he said he believed in a representative democracy. And at that time, of course, that representative democracy basically reflected voters who Madison was a member of the group. But theoretically, you believe in representative democracy and you define we the people as adults, irrespective of race, religion, ethnicity, then you have to go with whatever the majority says. And since he said consent of the governed and majority rules with, of course, as Hassan mentioned, some limitations on what government can do, I would think that he would say, okay, let the chips fall where they may.
So theoretically, if we can bring him forward into the 21st century, and that's a theoretical sort of analysis, but what we know in the moment in which he lived is when he had the chance and opportunity to create something that was more representative, he chose not to. And in fact, he helps create a system that would make it harder for more people to be included in we the people, right? And so I so appreciate the question because, you know, we have to take the theoretical because we're still living with the theoretical, still living with the work that he created, the Constitution. But, you know, when we go back and take the measure of the man, if you will, we have to do that in the context of the world in which he lived. And there's some real flaws and shortcomings. So, you know, what would he say if he peered outside of the window in the library and saw what we see today? He'd be like, oh, hell no, this ain't what I had in mind. You know? But, you know, as they say on the playground too, right? Like, he said, no take backs, right? You put it on paper, right? And we're taking that and we're applying the reality of the world in which we live today, all right? And I think that's where we are. But I do think we got to keep in mind who, you know, where they were at the time, right? Because if we gloss over that, then we run into danger about how we apply it in the present, right? Because the rollback goes back. I mean, we weren't the people, right, who were included. So many weren't included in that. But we're saying that, look, we see the value in the theoretical proposition. We've made it aspirational, and we have to apply that.
Sharon, can I add?
Sure.
I just want to add one quick thing that came to my mind when Hassan was talking. Some people say, some of my students say I'm a little too critical of the founders, Jefferson, Madison, Washington. But one of the things I say, they say you can't look at Madison from a 21st century lens. That's unfair, you know, because he was a person of the time, 18th, 19th century. So what I say to them is, and I think this may be what would happen today. As Hassan said, Madison would be up in the window saying, hell no. But many of his friends, and I say two of them come to mind, George Wythe, a founding father, signed the Declaration, and also the secretary's name is slipping my mind right now, but he was from Virginia and went out and became governor of Illinois. He was also a friend.
Edward Coles.
Edward Coles, thank you. Those two individuals were also of the time and also of Madison's group, but they took a different position. They were opposed to slavery. They freed their slaves. Edward Coles went out, supported abolition in Illinois, and also provided each one of his former slaves property so that they could have a piece of the American dream. I think that Madison would be up in the window, but I think there would be a whole lot of other people like Edward Coles and like George Wythe saying, Madison, you're wrong again, and you know what? We're going to win this time. We're going to have equality this time.
We have any other questions? Oh, yes, Tanya.
So I'm gonna focus in a little more tightly from the theoretical of what Madison would think about the current state of the United States and talk about what's going on right here, right now. I'm, Madam Mayor, you already know this. I'm from Washington, D.C. I grew up in D.C. I'm a seventh generation Washingtonian, but my family still owns our property in Orange County, Virginia, that I'm very proud of my formerly enslaved ancestors who built something out of nothing in a town where they were enslaved. We're very proud that we are still there and the people who enslaved them are not. But when I think about how I experience democracy as a Washingtonian who does not have any representation in Congress, as a black woman who is repeatedly told that my perception of history is wrong, that my ancestors were brought here in order to be taught how to be civilized, when they were brought here because of their expertise and skills, and they built this entire state, top to toe. They built it and farmed it and lived it. How are the institutions that exist now honoring that legacy? And how are the institutions, like the institution that exists here on this property, why are we creating separate institutions to represent the people who did all of the work? Why are we not taking the opportunity where we can to show a democracy that includes all of us together talking about our history and talking about our legacy and really amplifying the stories of what actually happened here, and saying we want an integrated group of people with a broad variety of backgrounds who have all experienced this, who have experienced it from the enslaved perspective, who have experienced it from the ownership perspective. Like, why isn't this place, why isn't Montpelier leading that charge, saying, guess what? We could have a governing body that shows the totality of of the experience in this region, which includes everybody, and be an example of how we can change how we talk about democracy in America, and be inclusive and say, yeah, there's some really horrible things that happened, there's some beautiful things that happened, but we want everybody at the table discussing it. And it seems like we just continue to create these institutions that have separate but equal boards and governing structures that do not fully integrate into each other and actually have the difficult conversation so that our institutions can reflect where we want to go.
Well, you actually described what we've accomplished and are working towards here at Montpelier through parity. In other words, having the members of the independent Montpelier Descendants Committee have equal say in an equal number of members who will sit on the board of the governing body of the Montpelier Foundation. So we have achieved this thing that we've called structural parity, in which the full decision-making of the board is a reflection of members of the broader community, but also members who are nominated to be on the board to represent and speak for the broader descendant community. And so we are practicing that. And that is important. And we want to become sort of that model of democratic governance. So we can be internally have those difficult conversations. And it's not just difficult conversations, it's difficult decision making that stems from these conversations. And so we're trying to do that. But at the same time, I will also say it is important, and I say this as a person who grew up in the black community, who grew up in a black church, who went to a historically black college, Morehouse College, that having institutions and organizations that are run by black folk is also critically important as well. And that's not just sort of a new phenomenon, right? I mean, one of the first things that happens at the moment of emancipation is that black folk not only create their own schools and where you got to deal with segregation, but they create their own churches, right? Formerly enslaved having to attend white churches, one of the first things they do is they leave white churches and create their own churches because they understood the importance of cultural and social autonomy, but having that decision-making over religion. Now they took with them that one white member, Jesus. They took that white Jesus with them, Reverend Walker. So we might need to have some conversations about that. I know. That's why I'm wondering why they took that one white version of him with them. But the point is, having your own institutions is important. So you have to have governing bodies over the main institutions that are governing our broader spaces and public spaces like we have here. But I also think it's critically important that we continue to have those organizations that represent and speak for the voice of black folk and for those who are historically marginalized in this nation because they contribute something very special and the perspective that they bring is critical.
Yeah, I'm glad that Hassan took that question as the board chair. He answered it exactly what I was thinking, but he articulated it best. And I do think that Montpelier can be an example, and we're striving to do that. And I'd like to see, Monticello and Mount Vernon, kind of take a look-see, because here we go. All right, that's what we want to hear. Very, very good. And the only other thing I would say is the example that the questioner raised about separation, separate but equal Plessy is an important example to remember our history. And one of the things that they don't know about that case, because if you look at the decision, it said, if people are going to get together across racial lines, it has to be the result of natural affinities, mutual appreciation, and mutual respect. Now, the reason why I mention that is because it's a lie. It's a fallacy. The Supreme Court created a fallacy that Plessy versus Ferguson was all about choice. The reality is, it stopped the choice. Blacks and whites with mutual appreciation, with mutual respect and natural affinities, they couldn't get together because the law said you have to be separate on the train. And so when you look at Montpelier and what has been done here, this is about the third car. See, if they really believe, the Supreme Court justice really believed what they said, natural affinities, mutual appreciation, they would have said you have to have 3 cars. One black, one white, and one for people, one for Americans that have mutual appreciation and natural affinities. You know what I say to my students? I would have liked to have seen that experiment. I would have liked to have seen how many Americans were on that third train. See, that would have given us an idea of where those descendants of James Madison would have been. Where would they have been in 1896? And I bet on Americans. I think that third car would have been pretty full. And at Montpelier, it's pretty full today. And I hope it is at Monticello as well.
And Gail says so.
And forgive me for shouting out loud. I just have to, it's important that we acknowledge the work that's being done at Mount Vernon and Monticello as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail.
Thank you,
Gail. I am a descendant of some of folks who did build some of those black institutions locally, including starting and signing deeds on the churches here right down the road. And what I would like to do is build on this concept of not glossing over how we got here. So in the last year, we have struggled for parity. We achieved parity, and as a descendant, the mother of a child who is here, Joe, by the way, who is a descendant on both sides of our family. Her father is a descendant, I'm a descendant. I would like to know, now that you all are on the board, this parity board, what are you doing to represent our interests? I'm not talking about MDC. I want to know what you specifically, in the context of very Madisonian concepts of representative democracy, what are you doing concretely to advance the interests of descendants now that we have achieved this parity, and not wanting to gloss over how we got to this point? Because we're speaking very loftily about how we got here.
You mean how we got here in terms of the
structure of this place, Montpelier,
yeah,
and achieving parity?
Well, I mean, one of the things that the reason why we're here today on this occasion, right, is to talk about memorialization, the Memorialization Project. right? I mean, this is, a joint effort that we're saying the Montpelier Foundation is committed to investing in how we tell the story about the enslaved community here, how we tell the story about the United States, how do we tell the story about the Constitution and James Madison. And so it's not just a function of sort of, okay, now there are some members on the board who were nominees from the descendant community. It's what does the full integration of decision-making then look like? What grants are we going after? What financial decisions and choices are we going to make now that we're members of the board? Now look, I'll speak frankly, every historic site, presidential site, museums coming out of the COVID moment are facing financial challenges. There's a lot of things that we could do to raise money, right? We could bring back, one of the things that they used to do, some of y'all might not notice, this is a plantation. You could raise a whole lot of money having weddings at plantations. Yes, you can. Whole lot of money. We ain't doing that here. Right. That's part of the conversations that we're having. What does it mean? Why? Because that's just disrespectful. This is a slave labor camp. We're not having weddings at Auschwitz. We ain't having weddings here. That's right. So that's part of the decision making. When you change the constitution of the members of the board, the decision making body, we're bringing all of that with us to those conversations and to the decision making. So some of it is big planning, it's grants and what we're going to do. Some of it's who are we going to partner with, who are we going to involve in the decision making, and who are we consulting. Some of it's just, okay, we're sitting down in a room and we're making the tough decisions about what is the future and what is the direction and what are we going to do. Okay, so if we're not going to take this money, that means we got to get some money from someplace else. So now how are we going to do that? So it is about who's at the table. It is about consulting and being in conversation, but it's also about a commitment to moving forward from a perspective of truth and honesty. And we're not always going to get it right. We understand that as well. We're going to make some stumbles, but when we do, we're going to own them. And we're going to say, okay, how can we do better? So we're trying to figure this out. Now, this is the first in the nation to do this in terms of full equal parity in decision-making of the governing body of a presidential site. Right? It was a fight to get here, but it's going to be a fight to keep it going. And so we're not afraid to ask for help and assistance. We're not afraid to receive criticism. But we also realize that this is still going to be a fight because a lot of people still don't want this to be. They still don't want it to be. Don't believe that it's right. This is not just about power. This is also about identity and all this other stuff. But we're here to say we're not going back. We're moving forward. And if that comes at a particular cost, it does. But the members of the board, the people who have accepted this challenge, those who have come before, those who have laid this pathway, and those who are going to come out, are doing it because they realize the power of this place and what can be accomplished here and how it can serve as a model. So a lot of it is going to be big decisions, but some of it is just the daily small conversations that we have with staff coming up and saying, okay, what about this decision? That's a good, now this is in the spirit of parity and moving forward. So there's a lot that's visible, but then I think there's also a lot that's going to be unseen. But thank God I don't have to do it all by myself. And thank God we got Yola Dance who's going to do all of it for me. That's also part of that decision making, right? So.
I would just add that, I believe that the truth will set us all free. And that's what I've tried to do in my academic career. That's what I do. I mean, I stay in my lane. And so what I do is I write, and I do a lot of media stuff, and I teach. And so I believe that the truth is important, and it's the descendant stories need to be out there, as well as the truth about this entire country. And I believe that once folks understand the full truth, we'll be a little bit better. And that's why I'm concerned about things that are happening, particularly in Florida, with the denial of the truth. And so I'm going to do everything I can in my role as an academic, but also in my role here at Montpelier, to see that truth comes out. And yeah.
No, I'm going to call on someone else. But before I do, I said, as an observer of the French family, one always has to make a tip to the French family. I see so many of you here. James, of course, is someone I reached out early on. You always have been a little ahead of your time. So we very much appreciate the contribution you've made on these issues. Please.
I am Mayor Shella Ashbaz Washington. I am the 6th generation directly connected to the Barbers, James Barber. Slavery was the largest forced immigration in the history of the world. And my statement is, now let's have a conversation. Along with what Ms. Jones said here, I would like to see, as a lifetime resident, 6 generations connected to James Barber, Barber's Virginius, all Barber, friends with James Madison, etc. I would like to see more inclusivity as well. I research a lot at our clerk's office, right down here at the courthouse, which is our beacon for everything. And I can truly say that I am the only black face in that clerk's office researching the original records from 1734 till today. I have uncovered beautiful things about our enslaved community, our black community, and now I'm on a mission. I was in the clerk's office looking for information on my mother's father's people. It was 15. He had 14 brothers and sisters. Their last name is Sherman, which is a prominent white name here. And I always tell the Shermans we're cousins. My grandmother was a cousin. But with all that said, in that research, I'm just trying to find them. I found maybe 5, they all, some went to Philadelphia, etc. But now I'm in this box of the deaths that occurred in Orange County from 1840 to like 1890. And I'm looking for Shermans, but looking through these death cards, it was just so fascinating to see slaves that were born in 1776 to live to be 100 to 1876. And then they died in what many don't know about are poorhouses. So I researched poorhouses. They were usually on a farmland, you didn't have family, and that's where they died. And then the diseases they died of. So with all that said, I just would like to see more expression given to us as a people, not so much Montpelier and James Madison. And this is very emotional for me because my grandmother lived to be 97, told me such wonderful, beautiful stories about this, and lived on Hampstead Farm, which is still a dairy farm. And I take the gall to drive up to any of these antebellum plantations and knock on the door, look in windows, and tell them who I am. But with all that said, now I'm on a quest to recognize all of the black folks that died in Orange County, and to tell, they indicate what they died of, the diseases. A lot of children were burned, that they died from burns, they died from teething. But with all that said, I would like to see more of that expressed. And Orange is rare, and you'll read about it in books. They still have the most intact records from 1734 till today, and you can go there and touch them. And that's what I would like to see, just more of that. And communication is the key to understanding, and knowledge is power and empowering.
Well, certainly we appreciate what you're saying, and most importantly, appreciate the work that you're doing. I mean, there's so many stories, so many untold stories, so many stories that need to be recovered. And it's going to take local people. It's going to take local historians, right? Local genealogists who are doing this work of uncovering and recovering. Montpelier and the stories that we're capturing here are not to be finite, right? These aren't the only stories. We're envisioning Montpelier, if I can use the royal we, as sort of a point of entry. Right? We're digging down where we can with the limited resources that we have, but with the people who are committed to do it, but as a point of entry to get people not only to learn about what happened physically in this place and the places that are connected to it, but to say, you know what, what's going on with my family? Where are my roots? Where are my connections? How does this speak to my community here in Orange and beyond? My family is in Virginia, but my family's also roots go back to enslavement in Georgia, right? And so but the stories, even the ones that we don't know, they're parallel stories, right, in each of these different places. And we may never, there's a project right now called 10 Million Names. We have a project here at Montpelier to identify by name all the enslaved folk here, but there's a broader project trying to find the names and discover the names of every enslaved person, the 10 million who wound up here, right? Because there's something powerful in calling the name. And so what we're saying, you start with the name and you tell the story, right? But Montpelier certainly is not to be the end. In many ways, we're hoping it can be a beginning, a point of entry to do the very exploration and the deep work that you're doing on your own. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I applaud your work and look forward to seeing a book on it also. It is indeed.
Yeah, did you have a question?
Yes, I'm curious as to what Madison would be saying about the whole squabble we're having over states' rights now. I think especially about the fight between Biden and the governor of Texas over the boundary issue and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
What do you think, Michael?
Well, you know, I'm not a Madison scholar. I'd almost have to defer to Madison scholars. But Madison, you know, he believed in the principle of federalism. And that means that principle is, look, we have a federal government and we also have state and local governments. And they each have their own sort of sphere. But he also, of course, agreed in the Supremacy Clause that the federal government is supreme. And so even though you have this principle of federalism, the federal government is supreme. And when those issues conflict, when those roles conflict, the federal government supersedes the state governments. And so I suspect that under that approach, theoretically, he would support the federal government's position.
Have we, yeah, of course, it's good to see you.
What is your message to everybody here and everybody listening? To how we can all do our best to help America move forward in a peaceful, forward way and keep us as a leading democracy?
Yeah.
Well, I could just like to, you know, weigh in on that. I'm not, as I say, I'm not the scholar. I am a reformed politician. I think that this whole issue that we're having around history is obviously terribly important, and important not just in terms of, you know, factually understanding who we are, why we're here, why we have opportunities and why we have challenges, but the greater point, which is your question, is how we can come together as this one American family. And if you go to a family reunion, a family gathering, and you pull out the family photo album, and the only pictures in there are the European men, that has quite an impact. You've been a part of this family all along, and yet you are completely ignored and disrespected. And I think that that's what all of this, what Mr. Sheeran, I think he said his name is, what he's talking about is our dignity, our sense of our humanity. And if we can ever restore that, if that's the beauty of this process, and it's become the central issue in the political fight in one party now, this notion of American history. And it is all, at the core of it is about our shared humanity. This is my view, our shared dignity and the capacity of this very dysfunctional family called America, figuring out how we can all function as one. I think if we're honest about this, if we genuinely look at our history, you know, I think we can get there. I think a lot of people want us to get there. We saw that in the aftermath of George Floyd. There were as many young white kids out there as there were any other group out there. They get it. They see the possibilities. And I do think we've just got to insist upon the truth, and I believe that we as a family can be that family. I think the possibility is there, but we're in for, as Betty Davis said, and all about it. We're fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a tough ride, you know.
If I could add just one thing, you know, I've been thinking about this, and as I teach students at The Ohio State University, you got to say the, at The Ohio State. That's what's on the check, so as long as it's on the check. And they're deeply concerned about it. This is a young generation of people, or the generation who are students now, this generation, they want change. I mean, we just saw the largest protest in American history in 2020, and these were led by young people. And so they're asking this question about, you know, what does the future hold, and how can we create a society that respects us, that respects everybody? You know, James Baldwin said that we can disagree and still love each other. He said we can disagree and still love each other, and that's powerful. But you know, he had a comma, and he said, but we can't do that if you question my humanity, if you question my right to exist. Then it's no longer just a disagreement about policy. It's not just simply different. You're questioning my right to breathe, to exist, and we're doing that in our politics with far too many groups, with far too many people. And so that really begs the question, and I think we have to be serious about this. This is what I'm saying. You know, I like to be hopeful, but my optimism is a little bit low in the sense that we got some tough times ahead, because we're not just simply dealing with the realm of sort of, well, you just don't understand, you have to see these facts. You're just missing the facts. If I can just share the truth with you, then you will understand and you will no longer question my humanity. That's not where we are. People are refusing to question the humanity of far too many folk. So this is no longer sort of we're beyond policy discussions and our disagreements in the public square. This isn't about policy anymore. We're debating the right of whether or not a democracy should exist.
Yeah.
And we're debating the right whether or not people should, including women as a whole, should have equal rights of everybody else. And so I only think, and this is the civil rights historian in me now, going back to the civil rights era. Some people coming out of the civil rights movement said, and speaking about constitutional questions, they believe that the principal problem that black people were facing was a moral one, that racism was fundamentally a moral problem. And that if only we could prick the conscience of white folk, right, of segregationists, of white supremacists, they would see the shortcomings of their actions, the immorality of their actions, and they would change. And there were a number of people, James Lawson, Reverend King, Diane Lawson, who believed that fundamentally the problem was a moral problem. But you also had the vast majority who said the problem ain't moral, the problem is political, the problem is about power. It's about who controls power. This is a political problem. And if it's a political problem, if it's a power about power, then you need political solutions. You need solutions that revolve around power. So we can make the moral appeals. We can make the appeals to conscience. But I think we also have to really think strategically about gaining the levers of power in a difficult time when it's becoming harder and harder to actually gain power when we think about states and state legislatures gerrymandering districts in Alabama and Ohio and these other places. But this is not going to be solved through simple conversation. This is going to be solved through political action. This is going to be solved through power. And I think we have to be prepared for that. It doesn't mean it has to be bloody. It can be civil, but it's going to be about power. And I think we have to be prepared for that.
Yeah.
One of the really good things about the original Constitution and the concepts is the separation of powers. And it makes it very hard to accumulate enough power to ultimately control. And so the separation of powers principle is a good one. I'm glad we have it, and we may need to structure it a little bit differently in order to make sure that no one achieves enough power to absolute control. But I would also say your question is a really, really good one, and the short answer, and I don't know how we do it, but the short answer is that we need to create empathy for the other. We've lost it. If we ever had some of it, we've almost lost all of it. We don't have any empathy for the other person, you know, for the person that lives down the block, or the person that lives in another city, the person who has a different race or religion or ethnicity. We gotta be able to create it somehow, and I'm a big fan of Star Trek, you know, the original, right? Kirk, Spock, you know, original Star Trek, right? So one possible solution, and I hope it doesn't have to come to that, but if there is life somewhere else, and they come at us, you're going to see a whole lot of Americans and a whole lot of people around the world say, hey, it's all about the human beings now. We don't care what color you are, what religion you are, you know, it's about, hey, we got to deal with those other folks. So I hope it doesn't come to that, but we got to create some empathy.
So he's counting on green people bringing us together. Thank you all at Montpelier Foundation. Thank you, our wonderful audience. Thank you, Michael Higginbotham, Hassan Jeffries, for this wonderful conversation. The Constitution was with us when the conversation began, and I believe it's still with us even as after this conversation today. So thank you, have a blessed day, and take good care.
Thank you.